may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, so we know every single year, I mean, you have those bounce back players. Every single year, you have the guy coming back from injury that can actually help you win your fantasy league because he's going at a discount in fantasy drafts the next year after a disappointing finish. Now, I'm not going to say every wide receiver that we are discussing in this video is going to be just that. What I want to do is I want to look at all of these wide receivers and I want to look at why we think they failed in 2020. In the case of some of the guys later on, they failed in 2019 as well. And what makes them a candidate to actually bounce back in 2021, provide value on where they're being drafted. We have real life draft data here available for the video and try to discuss if we think that this is fair, if we think they're still being overdrafted or maybe actually a value. But of course, before we get into it, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out so much. And also this Saturday, June 19th, in Austin, Texas, we have our official Fantasy Flock meetup. Now, I'm sure you've heard this announcement a million times, so we're going to keep it brief. But if you can come out, please do so. Really trying to meet as many people as I can before we move to Florida. But that's it. Let's dive into this video. Let's talk about Michael Thomas. Now, here with Michael Thomas, he's honestly the main reason I wanted to make this video. I really wanted to go through and try to discuss some of these wide receivers after we got a message on Patreon of someone asking me if we think that Michael Thomas can finish as the wide receiver 1 overall in 2021. And the short answer to that question is yes. I think Michael Thomas does have the potential to yet again be the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy. And here, it's a very simple analysis with Michael Thomas. I mean, you're going through, and the one large question mark that you're going to have with MT is the quarterback play. Now, I'll say if you look at the quarterback room right now, you have both Taysom Hill and Jameis Winston as really the only two candidates for this starting job. Now, I know Taysom Hill has the contract. A lot of people are saying it's a fake contract based on non-guaranteed money, which of course is most likely the case. Nonetheless, Jameis Winston, that prototypical guy, and Winston is the player that you desperately want at quarterback if you were drafting Michael Thomas in fantasy this year. Now, I know the majority of people believe Jameis Winston is going to be the starting quarterback for this team, and I would be right there with you. I think that Jameis Winston is the favorite to go through and start 16 games, but you don't have that guarantee. What we have to understand is even if Jameis Winston is the projected starter, what happens if 4 games in, the Saints are 0-4, Jameis Winston has over an interception a game? You know New Orleans, you know everybody in that fan base is going to be screaming to hand the reins over to Taysom Hill based on what we saw in 2020. And I know Michael Thomas was decent with Taysom Hill, but still not nearly the same wide receiver, not nearly the same passing volume that you would want for Michael Thomas. Now we go through and we have to remember what Michael Thomas did last year. We have to acknowledge how poor his 2020 performance was when he was being drafted at 6 overall in the majority of drafts. And I want to remind y'all, I mean, yes, he was going at 6 overall, but he was going far and away ahead of all of these other wide receivers. I mean, he was the wide receiver 1 by a wide margin. And he ends up leaving week 1 due to a high ankle sprain. I mean, this is a massive injury that clearly limited Michael Thomas throughout the entire season. Of course, he suffers another setback, another injury after he does come back from that high ankle sprain. But I think we can safely say that Michael Thomas really never came back from that injury. I mean, you look at his points per game this year in weeks 9 through 14. So the majority of the time where he was actually playing, I don't want to look at week 1 because we know that's the week that he actually got injured. And in weeks 9 through 14, Michael Thomas was the wide receiver 33 in points per game. So I simply can't buy into the fact that Michael Thomas was supposed to be 100% during this time. I mean, because you go back to 2019 and Michael Thomas was just completely dominant. I mean, you don't go from being the wide receiver 1 in fantasy to being the wide receiver 33 unless that injury is still bothering him, unless that injury has something going on. But what I really want to look at is the actual target competition that Michael Thomas had in 2020. Keep in mind, he was playing in a very small sample, but I want to focus in on how bad this team was for the New Orleans Saints with their receiving options beyond Michael Thomas. So you had Alvin Kamara actually leading this team in targets with 107. So I understand Alvin Kamara, one of the best players in the open field at making defenders miss. But at the end of the day, you really don't want your running back leading the team in targets. Then you had Emmanuel Sanders at 82, Jared Cook at 60, Michael Thomas himself at 55, but obviously Michael Thomas barely played at all. Then Traquan Smith last on this list. But here, both Emmanuel Sanders and Jared Cook are gone. So that is leaving 142 targets in this offense. I mean, Emmanuel Sanders, the second leading wide receiver here, Jared Cook, the third guy, them leaving has to be noted. Them leading has to really go into the projection with what you're looking in for 2021. But taking a step back, I really want to focus in on how dominant he actually was in 2019. So you go through and you look at Michael Thomas, and in 2019, I mean, this is a player that was clearly the wide receiver one. I mean, he averaged 24.5 points per game. He was record breaking at the wide receiver position. Now, I know that we can say he's wide receiver one. He averaged 24.5 points per game, but that really doesn't encapsulate how dominant Michael Thomas actually was. The second best wide receiver in fantasy that year actually averaged 19.6. So Michael Thomas actually averaged an additional 20% compared to the wide receiver 2 in fantasy. 20% more points per game came from Michael Thomas than the wide receiver 2. That is absolutely ridiculous. That can't be overlooked. And a very similar situation here. I mean, in 2019, this happened with really nobody competing for targets on this team. I mean, Michael Thomas had 185 targets. That's how he was dominant like this. That's how he went through and broke the reception record. Now, Alvin Kamara was second on this team, Jared Cook third, Ted Ginn Jr. fourth. But we're looking at this as a situation going, okay, this is much closer to 2019 than you would expect a massive fall would indicate given his ADP. So right now in 2021 drafts, the ADP is set at having Michael Thomas as a mid-third round pick at the ADP 30, and he is going currently as a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. I mean, you are consistently seeing Justin Jefferson, Terry McLaurin, and Keenan Allen all go over Michael Thomas in drafts. Now, I am completely fine taking Keenan Allen over Michael Thomas. I think I would actually do that myself, so I do not see a problem at all with that draft price. But going to Justin Jefferson and going to Terry McLaurin, there, I don't necessarily think I can get behind drafting either one of those two wide receivers over Michael Thomas. If you wanted to present me an argument for Justin Jefferson over MT, given the fact that Jefferson just put up one of the most impressive rookie seasons of all time, then yeah, sure, I'm not going to argue too much with Justin Jefferson. But Terry McLaurin going over Michael Thomas when Terry McLaurin's best finish in fantasy was the wide receiver 21. I just simply cannot get behind that in the slightest, because clearly you're seeing that the fall was due to injury. It wasn't like it was due to any outside factors. So with Michael Thomas, he's playing on a team also that the second best wide receiver here is Traquan Smith. The third guy is Deontay Harris. So you're going, okay, what are we missing here? Michael Thomas led the NFL in targets, was historic with the amount of receptions he had just 2 years ago. He is on an offense where he is going to be soaking up literally every single target that is not going to the running back. I mean, literally from that 2019 season, there is less competition for targets now than there was then when he broke the reception record. So are we that worried about the quarterback play? Because I don't think at 28 years old, all of a sudden you're going to be expecting Michael Thomas to be a worse wide receiver. No, that's not going to happen. It's not like he lost athleticism. The talent is the same. The only thing that's different is the quarterback situation. So is the switch over to Jameis Winston that bad where Michael Thomas is now a mid-third round pick when Jameis Winston, the last time we had him as a full-time starter, he led the NFL in passing yards. I understand he was very bad in real life because he can't just continue to secure the ball. He has to turn it over every game. But if you're talking for fantasy, he produced 2 top 10 wide receivers in both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. So I don't see what the problem is here with a Michael Thomas. I think that we would be comfortable taking him in the early third. So Michael Thomas, someone we're probably going to be drafting a ton this season. Now, going over to our next guy, we definitely whiffed on him last year, DJ Moore. Okay, so with DJ Moore, going through, he is currently being drafted as the wide receiver 19, only 24 years old. And you go back to 2019, so his breakout year, that second year in Carolina, and he actually averaged 9 targets a game, 81 yards a game. He had 4 total touchdowns, and this gave him the wide receiver 16 finish. So he was a mid wide receiver 2 this year at only 22 years old. So naturally, you'd expect a 22-year-old wide receiver to continue to progress. You'd expect them to continue to develop their game, their route running, their yards after the catch, really everything that they can do. But with DJ Moore, he takes that step back and he comes in, and in 2020, he's actually drafted as the wide receiver 11 going into the year because you would project him to continue to get better, but he scales back to being the wide receiver 27, so a high-end wide receiver 3. I will say he finished the year a lot stronger than he started. He actually finished the year in weeks 10 through 16 as the wide receiver 16 in points per game. So obviously you like to see him finish strong. But I mean, he only averaged 7.8 targets this season. He averaged 81 yards a game and 4 total touchdowns. But the problem was the receptions drastically declined. You actually had the average yards per target and yards per reception go up for DJ Moore, which was surprising. But that's because they were using him further downfield. That's because they weren't asking him to run nearly as many crossing routes, the routes that pretty much guarantee that that target is going to turn into a reception. Now, if we go through and we try to look at where the targets are going to be in 2021, this is where it gets difficult. Because in 2019, that year where he was a mid wide receiver 2, I mean, the target leaders on this team were Christian McCaffrey at 142, DJ Moore at 135, Curtis Samuel, then Greg Olsen. So obviously, going into 2021, you don't have either Curtis Samuel or Greg Olsen, but what you had last year in 2020 was Robbie Anderson really coming on as, I don't want to say the wide receiver 1 for this team, but right up there. I mean, it's a wide receiver 1A, 1B situation with Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore, where Robbie Anderson actually led this team in targets with 136, followed by DJ Moore, then Curtis Samuel, then Mike Davis. But here you're having Curtis Samuel go to Washington, Mike Davis going to Atlanta, but the problem is Christian McCaffrey coming back to get a full slate of games, as well as them drafting Terrace Marshall in the second round. And I do not think that Terrace Marshall is going to be able to soak up all of those Curtis Samuel targets, but Christian McCaffrey definitely is going to. Now, we do have to address the fact that you're transitioning over from Teddy Bridgewater to Sam Darnold. And here with that switch, I know a lot of people are going to want to say that Teddy Bridgewater is a better quarterback than Sam Darnold, but this Carolina Panthers team went through and they looked at both quarterbacks and they went, okay, Teddy Bridgewater is so bad. We are going to pay his entire contract. We are going to ship him to Denver for literally nothing. I mean, like a 6th round comp pick. It was literally nothing. It's almost as if he just goes to the waiver wire. And then they go out and trade a 2nd round NFL draft pick for Sam Darnold, paying his own contract. So presumably you have to expect that this is going to be a quarterback upgrade for DJ Moore. And presumably, you have Curtis Samuel leaving the offense, which is going to open up targets. But the problem is Christian McCaffrey coming back, soaking up some of those targets that is left. And also Terrace Marshall getting drafted, maybe getting a little more usage in the red zone, given the fact that Terrace Marshall is that big-bodied wide receiver. So with DJ Moore, I will say that it's a very hard evaluation. I love the talent. I think next year when you have Robbie Anderson leaving this team and it's just Terrace Marshall and DJ Moore, I will be very, very excited. But at wide receiver 19, I think it's going to be very hard for me to say he's either a target or a fade. I think really you just take him if you're in a situation where you think you're going to be getting a Carolina Panthers stack, or he falls a little bit below his ADP and you're thinking you're getting good value. But it's not like Michael Thomas. It's not like I'm going out of my way to draft him, even though I love DJ Moore, the wide receiver. Trust me. I mean, DJ Moore in Dynasty is a straight bargain, but in redraft leagues this upcoming season, it's a little harder to say. So now let's bring up someone that historically I have been way too high on. Let's bring up Odell Beckham Jr., who is 28 years old, so you're expecting him to still be in his prime, being drafted as the wide receiver 31 as well. But here you go through and oh my gosh, I mean, Odell Beckham Jr. has been horrendous as of late. Now, in 2020, he was actually drafted as the wide receiver 12 in fantasy drafts, which is crazy to say. I do not remember him going nearly that high in drafts, but nonetheless, he was drafted as a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. He finishes as the wide receiver 37 in points per game, but honestly, it was uglier than that. Honestly, it mainly came from one massive performance where there were a couple plays that were a little gimmicky and you wouldn't necessarily be able to project them on a week-to-week basis. So 2020, very disappointing. That one big performance, then he tears his ACL in week 7. Now in 2019, he was actually being drafted higher in fantasy drafts. Remember, this is his first year going to Cleveland. This is when he gets traded, and it's after Baker Mayfield's rookie year where everybody's all in on the Baker Mayfield experience with Odell Beckham Jr. And after getting drafted as the wide receiver 7 in fantasy drafts, he actually finishes as the wide receiver 35. And this is a year that I really want to focus in on because it's a full sample, so we can go through and we can say that we have a decent mark on what to expect with the volume that he's receiving. And here he gets 8.3 targets per game, 65 receiving yards a game, and 4 total touchdowns. So really nothing you can get excited about. I mean, the volume is even there and he's just not producing with it. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, well, if he hasn't produced in 2 years, why are we even bringing him up? And it's because he was dominant in New York. We have to remember 2018, he was the wide receiver 8. 2017, he was the wide receiver 3. 2016, he was the wide receiver 3. So we have to sit here and we have to go, this is someone that has never been the same after getting traded to Cleveland. Is there any reason to believe that this is going to be different coming into this year? And to be honest, I am going to have a hard time giving some solid advice with Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I just want to say that I think the price point of him being the wide receiver 31 is completely fair. But the problem is he tore that ACL in week 7. So this is going to be something that lingers into training camp with his recovery. And also we have seen these injuries start to stack up for Odell Beckham Jr. Where in 2018, he had that quad contusion that left him out 4 games. In 2017, he had a fracture to his fibula, which actually required surgery. So we're in a situation where we're going, okay, Odell went from being an elite wide receiver to all of a sudden getting traded, then completely dropping the ball with his production. But the quarterback play has seemed to get better with Baker Mayfield that we saw at the end of the season. So please, guys, this is one spot that I want to say go draft Odell Beckham Jr. at this price, but I think I may be a little bit biased here. I would really like to hear your opinions if you are currently watching this as the live premiere, or if you are watching this as a video later on. Please just drop it as a comment below, because Odell, I want to say that I like the price, but I just have a very hard time buying in after he's been bad consecutive seasons, and 2020 was horrendous. I'm going to be the first person to admit that. Now, let's go over to another guy that I have such a hard time evaluating. I mean, these players that are bounce back candidates, they're so hard for me to look at because I loved a lot of them. Juju Smith-Schuster, going to be our last guy here. Currently being drafted as the wide receiver 29, so in that same range of an Odell Beckham Jr., only 24 years old. It's absolutely crazy that he was drafted in 2017 and he's still only 24. I mean, he has been in the NFL for what has seemed like forever now. Now, if we go through and we look at Juju, I mean, we have to remember how great of a wide receiver he was. I mean, in 2018, he was actually being drafted as the wide receiver 9 in fantasy, given the fact that this is a player that came out and was absurd his rookie season. I mean, he put up historic stats with his age-adjusted production. I mean, he was only 21 years old in this season where he finished as the wide receiver 9. Now, going into 2019, he was actually being drafted as the wide receiver 5. In 2019 drafts, he was being drafted as the wide receiver 5, and I'll be the first person to admit I was the guy drafting him. I was the guy at the beginning of the second round, nonstop taking Juju Smith-Schuster after Antonio Brown leaves. I know a lot of people were saying, hey, Mason, Juju cares too much about his social media. Hey, Mason, Antonio Brown was the reason for his success, taking away attention from the defense. And Juju came out and face planted in 2019. He was the wide receiver 55, and it was such a weird season in that Juju suffered from so many injuries as well as losing his starting quarterback, where in 2019, Juju had a concussion, he had a knee sprain, and he had a toe sprain all in that one season that really derailed his year. We know that Pittsburgh was not in contention for anything at all, given the fact that Mason Rudolph was their starting quarterback. So after 2019, after that very disappointing season, I thought that Juju was the best value in fantasy drafts there was in 2020. This was my number one mistake last year of going out and being overconfident with the Juju Smith-Schuster bounce back And he was being drafted as the wide receiver 13 in league. So he really didn't even see that massive fall. But I was going, hey, this player's only 23 years old. We are getting Ben Roethlisberger back. We know that the injuries completely derailed his year in 2019. So I thought we were getting a value. But he finishes as the wide receiver 24 in points per game. He averages 8 targets a game, 6 receptions, 52 yards, and he ends up having 9 total touchdowns. So honestly, I don't even know if we can project 9 total touchdowns going forward. I think that may be a little bit aggressive for Juju Smith-Schuster. And the problem here is I believe in the talent. It's just the level of competition for targets is so high. I mean, it's very similar to Denver, where you're looking at this as a situation where you're possibly expecting very poor quarterback play with Ben Roethlisberger, who looked completely washed at the end of last season, who posted a career low by a long shot in his yards per pass attempt, and he's 39, so it's not like he's getting any better anytime soon. Then you throw in the fact that last year, Deontay Johnson led this team in targets with 144. Then you had Juju at 128, Chase Claypool at 109, and Eric Ebron at 91. They draft Najee Harris, so you would think that maybe they're a little bit willing to go over and run the ball more when they have that good defense. So I'm worried about Juju. I want to say that he's another draft day target, but I hate to kind of sit on the fence here with 3 guys. Y'all know that I really don't want to do that. But at the same time, what I really don't want to do is I really don't want to label someone as an avoid or a draft target unless I am fully confident with these takes. So please, if you have a strong opinion on any of the wide receivers in DJ Moore, Odell Beckham Jr., or Juju Smith-Schuster, please leave that comment below letting me know what your opinion is. Now, the one spot where we are going to have an extremely strong take is Michael Thomas has the potential to be the wide receiver 1 overall again in 2021. He is someone that I'm drafting almost every single time in the 3rd round. Really, the only wide receiver going directly ahead of him in ADP that I would prefer over him would be Keenan Allen, but Michael Thomas, a massive, massive draft day target. Now, thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. And of course, if y'all did, go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. Thank you to everybody supporting the show. We got some new members of the flock in Robert, Caden, Matt, Robbie, Dan, John, Ziggy, Blake, Oliver, and Devin. Thank you, my dudes.